The greatest army on earth marched into an empty field and kept marching for months. No enemy, no battle, no victory, just grass. And then more grass. And then hunger. Darius the Great, king of Persia, ruler of half the known world, the man who had conquered Egypt, Babylon, and everything in between, was being made to look like an idiot by people who didn't even have a city. Everyone back in Persepolis thought the Scythians were running scared. His generals kept telling him they were cowards, that they'd turn and fight eventually, that you couldn't just keep retreating forever. They were wrong about all of it, and by the time Darius figured that out, he'd already lost. But to understand how badly he miscalculated, you have to understand just how untouchable Persia felt in 513 BC. Darius had taken the throne through blood and cleverness. He had inherited an empire built by Cyrus the Great, the man who had freed the Jews from Babylon, conquered the Medes, and turned a small Persian tribe into a superpower in under 30 years. Then Cambyses, Cyrus's son, had added Egypt. By the time Darius was in charge, the Persian Empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the edge of India. No empire in history had ever been this big, and it had basically never lost. That's the thing people forget. Persia wasn't just powerful, it was undefeated. When they showed up at your border, the smart move was to surrender immediately, because fighting just made it worse. One after another, kingdoms had looked at that Persian army and said, "Fine, take it." The alternative was too ugly to think about. So when Darius decided to push north across the Danube and into Scythia, nobody in the Persian court thought twice about it. Why would they? The Scythians were nomads, barbarians. They had no cities, no walls, no organized state to speak of. They lived on horses and moved with their herds. What were they going to do against the army that had swallowed Egypt whole? There was one man in Darius's court who had doubts. His name was Gobryas, one of the older generals, a man who had actually fought on the steppe before. He pulled Darius aside before the campaign. "Great king," he said, "these people have nothing to protect, nothing to lose." "Then they have nothing to fight for," Darius said. Gobryas was quiet for a moment. "That's not what I meant." Darius didn't ask him to explain. That conversation would come back to him later. Much later. The army Darius assembled for Scythia was the kind of force that made witnesses describe what they saw in terms they normally saved for disasters. Estimates from ancient sources go as high as 700,000 men, though that number is almost certainly an exaggeration. Modern historians put the real figure somewhere between 70,000 and 150,000. Either way, it was enormous. An army of that size doesn't just march, it consumes everything in its path: food, water, fodder for horses, firewood. Every day that force was in the field, it needed a staggering amount of, just to keep moving. That detail matters. Remember it. To get into Scythia, Darius needed to cross the Danube. He solved this problem the way Persia solved most problems, by engineering it. He had a bridge of boats built across the river, hundreds of ships lashed together, planks laid across them, a road on the water. It took weeks to build. His generals watched the thing get constructed and felt that familiar Persian confidence. We can build anything, go anywhere, do whatever we need. The Scythians had no answer for this. A Scythian chieftain named Idanthyrsus watched Darius's army cross the Danube from a distance. He didn't try to attack the bridge. He didn't try to stop the crossing. He just watched. Around him, his riders sat on their horses and watched too. "Let them come," Idanthyrsus said. "They're walking into a box." His men didn't say anything. They already knew the plan. They'd been doing this their whole lives, not against Persia specifically, but against anyone foolish enough to follow them into the steppe. You just kept moving. You kept the enemy chasing, and you waited. Idanthyrsus had one rule for his people during the campaign: never fight the Persians in an open battle. Not once, no matter what. If the Persians came close, you rode away. If they split their forces, you picked off the smaller group. But a pitched battle? Never. The steppe was the weapon. Let it work. His advisors had one concern. What about the other tribes, the ones further east? If we retreat toward them, they'll think we're asking for help. They'll get involved. Good, Idanthyrsus said. Let them get involved. We'll need them to keep watch on the flanks. And if they refuse? If they think we're cowards for not fighting? Idanthyrsus looked at the dust cloud on the horizon, where 100,000 Persian soldiers were slowly marching north. Show them the alternative. Nobody refused. Darius entered Scythia and found nothing. Not nothing as in a small amount. Nothing as in literally nothing. No people, no animals, no food. The Scythians had rounded up their herds and driven them east weeks before. Any grain stores had been burned. Wells had been filled with dirt, or worse, something that would make you sick. The land was empty and hostile in a way that didn't feel natural. It felt deliberate, because it was. His first scouts came back shaking their heads. "Great King, there's no one here." "They retreated," Darius said. "Keep advancing. They'll have to stop somewhere." But they didn't stop. Every day, Persian riders went ahead looking for the Scythian army. Every day they found tracks, horse tracks, hundreds of them, always heading east or north. Never a camp, never a rear guard. Just tracks and burned grass and empty sky. The first week this was mildly annoying. The second week it started to bother the generals. By the third week, Darius's army was getting hungry. Not starving, not yet, but the supply lines from the Danube were long and getting longer. Every day they marched further from the bridge, the harder it was to keep the food moving forward. Darius sent a message to Idanthyrsus. The message was simple: come out and fight, or surrender, or acknowledge Persian sovereignty. Pick one. The messenger rode east for 3 days before he found the Scythian camp. Idanthyrsus read the message. Then he sent the messenger back with a reply that Darius would spend the rest of the campaign trying to understand. "We don't run because we're afraid," the reply said. "We have no cities for you to threaten, no farms for you to burn. There is nothing you can take from us. We'll fight when it suits us, not when it suits you. If you want a battle, keep following us. We'll be just ahead." Darius read this and didn't know what to do with it. This wasn't how enemies were supposed to talk. Enemies were supposed to be scared, or defiant in a way you could punish. This was something else, a kind of calm, total confidence that didn't fit any category he had a response to. His general, Artabanus, the cautious one, read the letter twice. Then he said the thing that nobody wanted to say out loud. "Great King, what do we do if they mean it?" "What do you mean?" "What do we do if they never fight? If they just keep going east forever? At some point, we can't follow." Darius looked at him for a moment. "They'll have to stop." "Why?" Darius didn't answer. Here's the thing about following nomads into their own territory. You're always on their terms. The Persians were used to fighting in terrain they'd scouted, against armies that had fixed positions, with supply lines connected to cities that could store food and equipment. The whole Persian war machine was built around that framework. You find the enemy, you build up a position, you apply overwhelming force, you win. The Scythians had just deleted the first step. There was no enemy to find. Not until they decided there was. And while Darius was figuring this out, his army was eating through supplies at a rate that was starting to alarm his logistics officers. They'd brought food for a campaign of a certain length, because campaigns had a certain length. You fought a battle, you negotiated a surrender, you imposed terms, you went home. Maybe 2 months, maybe 4. But this? They'd been marching for 6 weeks and hadn't swung a sword at anyone except the occasional Scythian raiding party that hit them at night and vanished before morning. Those night raids were something new too. The Scythians had figured out that they didn't need to win a battle to drain Persian strength. Every night, small groups of riders would sweep around the edges of the Persian camp, shoot arrows into the dark, kill horses, scatter supply carts, and disappear. By morning, there was no one to chase, just dead horses and confused guards. The Persian cavalry started sleeping in formation. Then they started sleeping in armor. Then they stopped sleeping properly at all. Darius pushed on. He had to. Turning back now meant admitting that this nothing army of nomads had stopped the greatest empire in the world. That was unthinkable. The whole empire was watching. Persian prestige ran on the idea that you could not beat Persia, full stop. The moment you showed weakness, every vassal state and nervous neighbor started calculating odds. Darius couldn't afford to come home empty-handed, so he kept marching east. And Edenthursas kept retreating. Not running, retreating. There's a difference. Running is what you do when you're scared. Retreating is what you do when you're winning. Edenthursas was winning. He knew it. His riders knew it. And very slowly, the Persian generals were starting to know it too. Gobryas came to Darius one evening after they'd been in the steppe for 2 months. He didn't say much, just, "Remember what I told you before we crossed?" Darius remembered. "They have nothing to lose," Gobryas said. "That means we can't defeat them. We can only exhaust ourselves." "We're not exhausted yet." Gobryas looked at the camp around them. Horses that were too thin, soldiers who'd lost weight, supply wagons that were running low. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The next day, the Scythians changed tactics slightly. Instead of just staying ahead, they started circling around the edges of the Persian force, hitting from unexpected angles. They'd appear on the left flank, fire a volley of arrows, and vanish before the cavalry could respond. Then they'd appear on the right, then behind. The Persian army started to feel like a slow animal surrounded by fast ones. One morning, a whole wing of Persian cavalry set out after a Scythian raiding party that had attacked before dawn. The Scythians ran. The Persians chased. This was finally it. They were going to catch them, force a battle, end this. The Persian commander rode hard for hours, pushing his horses to the limit. And then the Scythians simply stopped running. They turned around and sat there, calmly waiting, still on their horses. The Persian commander pulled up. Something felt wrong. He looked around and realized his cavalry had followed the Scythians into a narrow valley with poor ground. There were Scythian riders on the ridges above. There were more coming up behind to cut off the retreat. He ordered a withdrawal, fast. He lost 40 men getting out. When he reported back to Darius, he said only, "They let us chase them, great king. They wanted us to chase them." That night, Darius sat with his senior commanders and said nothing for a long time. He was a smart man. He'd outmaneuvered rivals, managed an empire spanning dozens of different cultures and languages, built infrastructure across half the known world. He was not a fool. But he'd walked into this with one assumption baked in, that his enemies would behave like enemies he'd seen before. They didn't. Somewhere to the east, Thyrsus was watching the Persian fires on the horizon and counting them. Fewer horses meant fewer fires. The count was going in the right direction. He turned to his second. "How long?" "Another month, maybe 6 weeks. Their supply carts are nearly empty. The men are sick." "Good," Thyrsus said. "We're almost done." He didn't say what came next. He was already composing the message in his head. The message that would tell Darius everything, but only if Darius was smart enough to understand it. A bird, a mouse, a frog, and 5 arrows. Darius would receive that message soon. One of his advisors would tell him it meant surrender. Another advisor, one of the honest ones, would tell him the truth. And that truth was going to be the worst thing Darius had heard in his entire reign. But before the message arrived, there was one more scene that Darius had to sit through. One final, humiliating demonstration of exactly how badly he'd misread this. It started when his scouts reported something strange to the north. The scouts said there was movement to the north, a lot of it, thousands of men maybe, riding hard in a direction that wasn't toward the Persian camp. Not attacking, not retreating, just moving. Darius sent a larger scouting party to get a better look. They came back 2 days later with a report that made no sense at first. The Scythians had found a hare. Not a metaphor, an actual hare, a wild rabbit running through the grass. And hundreds of Scythian riders had broken off from whatever they were doing and started chasing it, whooping, laughing, racing each other across the steppe like children. Darius got this report and stared at it. His army was starving. His horses were dying. He hadn't fought a single meaningful battle in over 2 months, and the enemy had just abandoned their positions to chase a rabbit. One of his younger generals laughed. "They're playing games. They're not even taking us seriously." Cambyses didn't laugh. He looked at the report, looked at the direction the Scythians had ridden, and said quietly, "They're sending a message." "What message?" "That they're not afraid. That we've been here this long, and they're still comfortable enough to hunt. They want us to know what this looks like from their side." The younger general stopped laughing. That was the moment, not any single battle, not any dramatic confrontation, when the Persian command started to really understand what had happened to them. The hare was the message. We're at home here. You're not. You've been chasing us for months, and we've barely noticed. Darius made a decision that night. He ordered the army to stop advancing. They would hold their position, consolidate their supply lines, and wait. If the Scythians wanted to play games, let them. Persia could be patient too. It was the right idea about 3 months too late. His supply lines were already stretched past the point where holding position helped. The food wasn't coming fast enough from the Danube bridge. The horses were already compromised. You can't just stop and wait when you've already been marching for months on shrinking rations. The damage was done. And Thyrsus knew exactly what holding position meant. It meant Darius had stopped moving forward, which meant he was about to start moving backward. The message arrived 2 days later. A Scythian rider came under a flag of truce and handed a package to the Persian guards. Inside were 4 things: a bird, a mouse, a frog, and 5 arrows. No words, no explanation, just these 4 objects wrapped in cloth. Darius assembled his advisors and set the objects on the table in front of them. The first advisor to speak was a man named Barbarian, who had risen through the court by telling Darius what Darius wanted to hear. He looked at the objects for a moment and smiled. "Great king, the meaning is obvious. The Scythians are offering their submission. The bird means they surrender their skies to you. The mouse means they give you their land. The frog means they offer their rivers. The arrows mean they lay down their weapons." Several other advisors nodded. This was a comfortable interpretation. It meant the campaign was about to end in Persian victory, which was how all Persian campaigns ended. Darius looked at Cowardice. Cowardice had been quiet through the whole presentation. He was looking at the objects with an expression that was not reassuring. "Cowardice," Darius said, "you agree?" "No, great king." Silence in the tent. "Then what does it mean?" Cowardice picked up the bird. "It means, can you fly?" He set it down. He picked up the mouse. "Can you hide underground?" He set it down. He picked up the frog. "Can you live in the water?" He set that down too. Then he pushed all 5 arrows forward. "Because if you can't do any of those things, these arrows will find you." Nobody said anything. "It's not a surrender," Cowardice said. "It's a threat. They're telling us we have no way out. Not unless we leave now, on our own. They're giving us the chance to leave." Barbarian started to object. "That interpretation is—" "It's the correct one," Cowardice said. He looked at Darius. "Great king, we need to go, tonight." Darius sat with that for a long moment. His entire life had been built around the idea that Persia didn't leave. Persia didn't turn around. Persia arrived, and things changed, and Persia stayed. Every instinct in him pushed against what Cowardice was saying. But he was smart enough to look at the facts. His army had been in the field for over 2 months. They'd fought almost no pitched battles, which meant they hadn't taken heavy casualties in the traditional sense. But the steppe had been killing them anyway. Horses dead from bad water and exhaustion, men sick from food that was running out and being replaced by whatever they could forage, which wasn't enough. He didn't have good numbers, but he didn't need them. He could see it. The army that had crossed the Danube at full strength was not the army sitting in this tent. And the Scythians weren't tired at all. That was the thing. Every time his scouts spotted them, they looked the same as they had on day 1. Of course they did. They were home. They knew where the water was, where the grass was good, how to read the weather. This was their land. They'd been living on it their whole lives. Darius's army had been trespassing in it for months and paying the price every single day. He looked at the bird, the mouse, the frog, the arrows. "We leave tonight," he said. The retreat from Scythia was not what Darius had imagined his Scythian campaign would look like. He'd imagined a victory march, cities surrendering, chieftains on their knees. Instead, he had a night march, fires left burning in the camp to fool Scythian scouts, sick soldiers and lame horses moving as fast as they could toward the Danube. He left his sick men behind. This is the part that doesn't get talked about much, but it needs to be said plainly. Darius ordered the men who were too sick to march to stay in camp. He left campfires burning. He gave the sick men instructions to make noise, keep the fires going, act like the whole army was still there. The idea was to buy time for the main force to get to the bridge. The sick men he left behind were not going home. The army marched through the night. Darius pushed them hard. Every hour between them and the Scythians was an hour they might survive. The bridge was still there. He'd left Greek allies to guard it, with instructions to hold it at all costs. There's a detail here that almost nobody knows, and it changes the story. When the Greek bridge keepers heard that the Persian army was retreating, a Milesian Greek named Histiaeus actually argued they should destroy the bridge and let Darius die. Trap the entire Persian army in Scythia. The Scythians had even suggested this to the Greeks, riding up to the bridge and saying, "Tear it down, and your master dies, and you're free." Histiaeus said no. His reasoning was simple and cold. Without Darius, the Persian Empire falls into chaos, and in chaos, the Greek tyrants like himself lose their power. Darius dying was bad for Darius, but also bad for Histiaeus personally. So, he kept the bridge standing. The Scythians arrived at the Persian camp just after dawn and found sick men and dying fires. They realized what had happened. They rowed hard for the Danube, trying to cut off the retreat before the Persians crossed. They almost made it. Almost. Darius's army reached the bridge first, by hours. They crossed in controlled chaos. Not a rout, but not orderly either. Men pushing, horses crowding, the sick and slow getting trampled. But they crossed. The Scythians arrived at the riverbank and watched the last Persian soldiers reach the other side. Edanthusus sat on his horse at the water's edge and looked across the Danube. He'd won. He knew it. Everybody knew it. He didn't pursue across the river. Why would he? The whole point was never to destroy Persia. The whole point was to make Persia leave and never come back. Mission complete. He turned his horse around and rode home. Now let's talk about what this actually cost Darius. The official Persian records, naturally, described the Scythian campaign as a success. Darius went north, demonstrated Persian power, returned victorious. This is what official records do. But the numbers tell a different story. Darius had crossed the Danube with somewhere between 70,000 and 150,000 men. What came back across that bridge was significantly less. Ancient sources mention losses of 80,000, though the exact figure is impossible to verify. What we know for certain is that he lost a huge portion of his army, not to battles, but to starvation, disease, bad water, exhaustion, and the steppe itself. Think about that. 80,000 men, or something close to it, dead without a major battle. No famous last stand. No charge of cavalry. Just men getting weaker every day in empty land until they couldn't go on. The Scythians lost almost no one. Edenthusus went back to his people, his herds, his usual life. The steppe looked the same as it had before Darius arrived. No walls had fallen, no cities had burned. Nothing had changed. Which was exactly the point. He hadn't needed anything to change, he just needed Persia to leave. Back in Persepolis, Darius had a problem that was partly military and partly something harder to deal with. The military problem was obvious. He'd lost a lot of men and horses and equipment for nothing. The harder problem was the story. How do you explain this to an empire that has never lost? How do you tell your court, your satraps, your conquered peoples that the greatest army in the world marched into the north and came back empty? You don't. You rewrite it. The Persian account of the Scythian campaign is a masterclass in creative history. Darius marched north, showed Persian power, punished the barbarians, demonstrated the reach of empire, returned. Glorious. Victory. Move on. Nobody believed it. Everybody knew. But nobody said anything, because saying something meant dealing with what it implied, that there was a limit to Persian power, that there were people out there who could not be beaten, that the model that had worked everywhere else against everyone else had a hole in it. And here was the hole. It only worked on people who had something to lose. Persia's entire method was based on leverage. You have cities? We'll burn them. You have farms? We'll take them. You have a dynasty? We'll end it. The offer was always the same. Give up now and keep most of what you have, or fight and lose everything. It was a good offer. Most people took it. Most people had too much to lose to refuse. The Scythians had nothing to lose. No cities, no farms, no palaces or temples or archives. They carried everything they owned on their horses. You couldn't take it from them because by the time you got there, it was gone. You couldn't threaten them with destruction because there was nothing to destroy. Edenthusus had understood this before the campaign started. This wasn't genius in the sense of a brilliant tactical innovation no one had ever thought of. It was simpler than that. He just knew what he had and what he didn't, and he refused to fight on terms that didn't suit him. The whole Scythian strategy came down to one insight. You can't beat an enemy who won't show up. You can chase them, you can yell at them, you can march into their territory and wave your banners and blow your trumpets. But if they just keep riding east, eventually you run out of food and you go home. That's not a complicated idea, but it's an idea that the most powerful empire on earth had no answer to. Darius spent the rest of his reign dealing with the aftermath. Not just the direct losses, but what the failure had communicated to everyone watching. Vassal states that had been quiet started making noise. The Greeks, in particular, took note. A few years after Scythia, when the Ionian Greeks revolted, the calculation they were making included what they'd seen at the Danube. Persia could be stopped. Not easily, not by everyone, but it could be stopped. The war against Greece that followed, first Marathon, then the much larger campaign under Darius's son Xerxes, was partly a consequence of the Scythian failure. Darius needed to re-establish the idea that Persia was unstoppable. He needed a clear victory over someone who would actually stand and fight. He never got it. He died before Marathon could be avenged. But that's another story. What matters here is Edanthursas standing at the Danube, watching 100,000 Persians scramble back across a bridge of boats. He'd done it with no walls, no forts, no siege engines, no treasury, no supply lines, no strategic depth in the conventional sense. He'd done it with horses, empty land, and a willingness to let the enemy's own appetite destroy them. The whole campaign, from the Scythian side, wasn't really a military operation. It was a patience test. Edanthursas knew his land would kill the Persians if he gave it enough time. All he had to do was not get impatient and fight when Darius wanted him to. So he didn't. The Persian court called the Scythians cowards for months, barbarians who ran from battle, savages without honor, afraid of Persian steel. The man who'd sent a bird, a mouse, a frog, and 5 arrows sat on the steppe with his herds and his people around him. He didn't care what they called him. He was home. They weren't. That was all that had ever mattered.